Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Here I am in Tarragona, in Spain, on the Mediterranean, on the coast of the Mediterranean. I'm sitting in the living room of Jonathan Revusky. We've been visiting for several days. I brought my computer. I'm looking forward to this discussion. We've had several discussions. And Jonathan has introduced a phrase called narrative imperative. And I think it's a very topical phrase because there's so many things going on that there's a huge narrative, say on the Venezuelan question, say on the silencing of these people, 59 people by the European Union, or kind of being excommunicated from world society. There is such a powerful set of agendas being acted upon by very powerful forces who control media. And so we need to be aware of these ways that media is affected. And nowadays, with artificial intelligence, we see people that we recognize, that we think of in certain ways, important people that comment often. And now we have to deal, is that really what they're saying? Or is it an artificial intelligence and AI construction? And it makes life very difficult because who's accountable for what anymore? Who is pulling the strings on what gets publicized and doesn't get publicized is accountable, has to face some consequences for the decisions they're making. So with that, Jonathan, do you want to introduce us to narrative imperative and sort of the array of issues that we might apply this to?
Well, narrative imperative it's a term that refers to something I had just a growing awareness of. For example, a few years ago when Putin sent the army into Ukraine, and he explained why he was doing it and so forth, all of the Western mainstream media referred to this as Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. In fact, you might be even hard-pressed to find invasion of Ukraine without the word unprovoked next to it. But we're talking about, so they're all in lockstep, and that is all genuflecting before what I call this narrative imperative. I also became aware that so many people had this internalized. Like it wasn't in the news. It was a movie review I was reviewing this recent, not so recent, a few years ago, this a new movie portrayal of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was portrayed by this actor, Joaquin Phoenix. And the reviewer was outlining the context of the movie, Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia. And I was struck by it because it said, oh yes, well, he had his campaign against Russia, but it didn't work out too well because he was defeated by the Russian winter and by the vast geography of Russia. And I thought, yeah, he was defeated by the Russian winter and the vast geography of Russia, but hold on, wasn't he actually really defeated by the Russian army? And but you also see it in reference to, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union over a century later by Herr Hitler, which also didn't work out too well. And and Hitler, like Bonaparte before him, he was defeated by the Russian winter and the vast expanses of Russian geography.
In other words, you must never say anything nice about Russians or Putin. This is a criminal bunch. They're a negative force in human history. And so the fact that they were the vital force that turned the tide against the Nazis in World War II.
Well, yeah,
The grit of these people is what saved the day.
The protagonism of the Russian fighting man, the Russian military leadership, and the Russian people, or maybe I should say Soviet instead of Russian, because it was this. But the core of it was, the Russian nation. I think you'd have to say. Their protagonism in the actual narrative is sort of taken away, and Hitler, like Bonaparte before him, is defeated by the winter and the vast geography. It's sort of interesting, but this was in close conjunction with a friend of mine here in Spain, and we were just, he's an interesting guy. We were talking, and somehow we hit on the topic of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and he said, "Oh yes, well," and he said almost the exact same thing in the movie review. He said, and I don't think he got this from the movie review. He said, "Well, you see, Napoleon was defeated by the Russian winter and the vast scale of Russia," or some such sentence. And when he said that, and I said, "Yeah, but he was also but he was actually also defeated by the Russian army." So it's an amazing thing, because in their version, in this version of World War II, the Russians are just a bunch of drunken, bumbling incompetents, and somehow they must have just drunkenly stumbled from the outskirts of Moscow all the way to Berlin, and meanwhile, I guess the German army was fighting the winter and the vast geography. It's but the concept sort of emerged. The narrative imperative here is, when you retell the story, you can't give the actual. It's somehow forbidden to give the actual Russians credit for the victory, for their victory, and you have to say that it was it was the winter and the defeated Bonaparte and Hitler.
And the whole discussion of history sort of becomes, the powerful forces don't want history to have to compete with a historical narrative or a group of people who are inspired by a particular narrative that gives them a coherent core to their nationality or national purpose. I mean, I think back to not that long ago in Canada, there was a standing ovation for a soldier, a veteran who had been on the Hitlerian side, who was accompanying Zelensky, who was receiving billions of dollars from the Canadian taxpayers. And he was introduced as a kind of heroic figure and given 2 standing ovations by all the parliamentarians, including the unelected senators and the MPs in the House of Commons of Canada. And so here is this standing ovation for somebody who was on the Hitlerian side, and all of this alliance with Zelensky and Ukraine, which the Canadian government of Carney, replicates. It's sort of showing that nowadays the Nazis are the good guys, and we should be with them.
But of course,
but you can only do this by disassembling history, by putting people so in the dark of their past that we have this example of all the parliamentarians of Canada standing up and cheering for the Hitlerian side in World War II.
Did they even know they were doing that? I mean, what's their knowledge of history?
Well, obviously, it's very small. I mean, my father fought in World War II. He fought in Italy, but he was on the side of Stalin. That our side, the United States and the British Empire, were with Stalin, who was, then a communist and a very aggressive Soviet leader. So this is just sort of erased from our memory. and many other things are being erased from our memory. History is sort of being negated and misrepresented and neglected, and people don't know where they're coming from. That's where they're going.
The outsized role of the USSR in defeating, Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, is also neglected in the West. It's not, you have all these films about D-Day, but in reality, D-Day was mostly a sideshow. In fact, by the time D-Day happened, the Red Army was basically chewing up the German army pretty systematically, and of course it was, the Soviet victory on the Eastern Front was quite inevitable, whether D-Day had succeeded or not. But it's quite extreme when one notes this desire to diminish the role of the Soviets in the war, and when given the fact that they are the ones who did most of the fighting and made most of the sacrifices to win. In fact, without the Soviets doing what they did, it seems rather unlikely that the Anglo-Americans would have actually defeated Hitler, or it's
well, with the Soviets are no more. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, the Soviet Union disappeared, and the Soviet Union, which was many nationalities federated together, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, many now supposedly sovereign independent countries were part of this thing called the Soviet Union.
Yes, but
part of the Soviet Union, the biggest part, Russia, it was reformed. It caved very deeply, economically, which was intended by the Americans. They were very pleased with themselves to see, that the Soviet Union was no more. They emerged as a unipolar superpower, so the sole government of the world, but this strange phenomena of one individual, Vladimir Putin, who stepped into the fray. He took over the leadership of the Russian government, and little by little, Russia was built back up into a major power. And, we've seen that exemplified, the extent of that Russian power in Yugoslavia. And it seems that the people of Russia have a much better life than they had in the early 1990s, and that the economy is actually, it's one place in the world where the economy is actually on a trajectory of an ascent. And Putin, turns out to be a pretty formidable figure, and yet somehow we have this legacy from the, going before the Cold War, before 1945. I mean, this hatred of Russia, that somehow Russia is a threat and a menace to Western civilization. It somehow has survived and is being resuscitated, it's very hard to take, seeing Mark Carney throwing in more billions of dollars and flying off, and now we're with the Europeans who are going to continue to fight Russia. We have that's a narrative imperative. You can't say anything nice about Russia. And what about Ukraine? I mean, weren't the Ukrainians and Russians pretty close?
Well, it was the same country throughout most of history, really. Yeah. I mean, this whole idea that there's some completely distinct people called the Ukrainians, well, one can debate it. There are differences, and there is a Ukrainian language. On the other hand, they're Slavs, they're Russian, they're Orthodox Christians, and they eat the same foods, and and they largely speak the same language, actually, because in fact the most used language in Ukraine on the social level, I think, probably is still Russian. but they want to convince you that somehow the Ukrainians are so while the Russians deserve no credit for being determined warriors in the Second World War, they just drunkenly stumbled all the way to Berlin. Somehow a completely separate narrative is constructed for the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians are these really, are something entirely different. Of course, it's true that for the ultra-nationalist Ukrainian, I guess the Ukrainian and the Russian are something completely different. But, it's...
Your ancestor was on some sort of governing council of Ukraine.
Oh, yes,
back in the day.
Avram Revusky, yes, my paternal grandfather, who I never met. He died in 1946. But he was only... That was I think around that was during the Russian Civil War, around 1919, maybe 1920. He was Minister of Jewish Affairs. Yes.
Oh my goodness! What would that mean?
Yeah, under a guy who was very vilified in history by the name of Simon Pitlora. And as I understand from family lore, my grandfather. There were these pogroms going on where Ukrainian troops were massacring Jews in Ukraine, and they killed a lot of people, and that's real. And my grandfather was sort of tried to get an audience, I guess, with Pitlura to ask him, what could be done. I'm not sure exactly, whether but anyway, he finally talked to Pitlura, and Pitlura said to him, well, there's, of war to fight, there's really nothing I can do about these pogroms because my soldiers, they just hate Jews, and, and later Pitlura was shot dead in Paris. And they wanted my grandfather to be to give testimony about what a terrible person Pitlura was and how he deserved to be shot. And my grandfather apparently declined to give said testimony. And but that didn't matter because Pitlura's assassin was, in fact, he did get off. Pitlura was successfully vilified in the trial, and as best I can understand, my grandfather didn't really think Pitlura was necessarily guilty of that much. Of course, it may be true that he didn't do enough to prevent his soldiers from massacring Jews. I don't know.
Well, let's put this in the present. Can we do that a little, or do you want to?
Well, you brought up this business of who my paternal grandfather was. But I never knew him. He died nearly 2 decades before I was born.
Well, it's coming to my mind that Christia Freeland, whose grandfather was the propaganda chief under Hitler, the Hitler regime.
But that's World War II.
World War II.
The stuff I'm talking about
anyway, she has been appointed as an advisor to Volinsky. Volinsky has hired her when she was an MP of Canada. And of course, she says, oh, well, that was my grandfather's day. But she is a Banderist, that there is this continuing power of this fascination with the SS and the Hitlerian legacy among many Ukrainians, including her. And now she's actually working for the Ukrainian government. She was definitely the person who put together that event in Parliament in Canada, where there was standing ovations for those in the service. But let's be clear. I mean, Ukraine is a very criminal society. It's a very deeply corrupted part of Europe with child trafficking, black markets in weapons. Many people in the United States and throughout Europe getting kickbacks from all this importing of weapons into service the Ukraine army. Zelensky himself, his part of his coming to power was, his ability to play the piano with his penis.
Well, that was just some comedy skit he did.
Yeah, he's an actor, and he played the president of. This is well known and well publicized, but maybe not everybody needs to be reminded of who he is, and Kolomoisky, who owned the TV network and put him in power.
Right,
and
right,
his
right.
appointment,
But okay, leaving aside the comedy skit with him playing the piano in that novel way, the question, he's being presented as actually having all this agency, when in reality, I guess Zelensky is basically a puppet of whatever political faction. And but what's going on now is very interesting because, it would seem that Zelensky is more or less like the ventriloquist puppet. I mean, imagine if you had to negotiate with somebody, and he's there. Remember what was that ventriloquist act with Charlie Parker? And the dummy. And you had this, and the ventriloquist dummy is being presented as party to the negotiations. So so you just, of course, it's true that Putin has tried to get around all this and he just wants to talk to the U.S. to resolve this, but they keep insisting that involving this Zelensky character, but it's like insisting that, imagine you go to whatever business negotiation, and the person you're negotiating with is doing a ventriloquist act. He's talking through a ventriloquist dummy, and you keep trying to talk to him, but he says, no, you've got to talk to the dummy, and you're supposed to pretend that the ventriloquist dummy is not just a piece of wood, but is actually some sentient individual that you're supposed to be negotiating with. I mean, all of the layers of farce. It's a tragedy, of course, this whole Ukrainian thing. I mean, it must be the better part of 2 million people dead, and most of them Ukrainians. But it also has all of these farcical levels of farce as well as the tragedy.
Well, one level of farce is, of course, the U.S. government under Biden was very forceful in bringing in arms and aiding the government, the puppet government of Zelensky, to make a stand against Russia. And this puts in a situation where the United States, of course, is with Ukraine. Now the United States, Trump is trying to work under the fiction that now he's a mediator of some sort, that he's he's with his former ally, the Ukraine, and Russia is on the other side. And well, you can't be the mediator when you're a party to the and the same in the Middle East. Trump is putting himself in a position where he's supposed to be a mediator between Israel, the close ally, and the Palestinians. But wait a minute, the United States and him in particular, his own person, he's more or less in the same camp as Netanyahu now as a war criminal. I'm talking about Donald Trump. He can't be the mediator between the Palestinians.
It's a neutral position.
It's supposed to be a neutral position, but it isn't. And of course, then you have, this arrest. What is that, to arrest Maduro in Venezuela, where you're going to, is this a war? Is it a police action? Suddenly the government of the United States becomes a police authority arresting Maduro. And, all of this, it points to the fact that there is really no international law, that international law is a farce, that we live in the time of survival of, you know, the most ruthless, the most desperate, the most.
Well, we always have, but the pretenses have been dropped.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Venezuela thing is very hard to get one's head around. That's definitely the case. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I watched a lot of YouTube videos and read what commentary I can about it. It's just very, very hard to make any sense. Is the kidnapping of Maduro just kind of a psyop? I mean, they're leaving because the existing government of Venezuela is just still there and running Venezuela. I mean, the whole statement that the U.S. is now running Venezuela doesn't seem to have any real basis to it. As for this vice president who was sworn in, what's her, Delcy, whether... But it's very strange because it would see, you know, this other woman got a Nobel Prize, Machado, and you would have thought that she would have protagonism in any of this, and of course, she's just been completely marginalized. But of course, I mean, a Nobel Prize for some wannabe quisling figure like this is kind of. You know, of course, they dropped a lot of pretense. Even when they made Obama, they gave Obama the Nobel Peace Prize for doing absolutely nothing.
And of course, they had to try to assuage Trump because he expected to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and
well,
they would have given it to him, but they'd give it to a friend of his. I mean, this Venezuela story, people, you know, it's displacing all the other. The focus on all the other stories, and it's becoming the prominent world story. And you know, as a Canadian, I'm here in Spain, in southern Spain, but I flew over from.
We're not in southern Spain, Tony.
What?
This isn't southern Spain.
No.
No, it's not. It's like more northeastern.
Well, we're on the.
We're in Catalonia.
Yeah, we're on the Mediterranean, so the southern border of Spain is the Mediterranean.
Okay, well, it doesn't matter.
But anyway, yeah, and it's, you know, as I say, it's a very interesting place, lovely place, and it's a former Roman military base. And there's
it was also I think it was one of the 4 major cities of the Roman Empire. There was Rome itself, Tarraco, which was the Roman name.
Yeah.
And there was, I guess, like in what's currently Turkey, there was Ephesus. And what else would have been a major Roman place? I mean, I think it was one of the 4 most important cities in the Roman Empire. Yeah.
So I'm trying to establish, you know, that I'm here in Spain, but I'm Canadian and very patriotic Canadian, and watching this whole drama play out with Venezuela, and then I see statements when I'm surfing the net, you know, Western Hemisphere is ours, you know, we will decide. There is the Monroe Doctrine, and back in 1823 we declared that, you know, Europe must not be involved in the Western Hemisphere, and that you know, basically declaring that the Western Hemisphere is the frontier or the hinterland of the American Empire. And, you know, in those days, there wasn't 50 countries. There was 13 countries when the United States started, 13 states. And then it expanded and expanded. And so the thinking would be that eventually the United States of America, it isn't America, it's of America, you know, will extend to the whole Western Hemisphere. And so this is unfolding in a context where, you know, Canada is actually the biggest country in the Western Hemisphere. It's the second biggest country in the world. It's a very strategic country. It's turning out the Arctic is turning to have high level importance. And this idea that somehow the Monroe Doctrine entitled the U.S. to be the sole imperial power of the Western Hemisphere, but there was one little difference with Canada, which did exist in 1823 and did go back to the 1500s with Cartier, is Canada was, when the U.S. was created, in opposition to the British Empire. And the British Empire still exists in a peculiar way, but certainly at the time of, in the 1800s, the British Empire was by far the dominant force in the world. So what is to be made of Canada? And are we just part of a 51st state that is in the making? Or what is to be the role of Canada? In Alberta, where I'm from, there's a very active and well-organized Alberta independence movement. And there are people going from Alberta and I think talking to the the Trump administration, which seems to be supportive of some kind of independent Alberta because of the importance of the oil resource. Anyway, so this whole perception, I mean, the Western Hemisphere is going to dramatically change, I think. And the U.S. isn't it's not a stable entity. It's a very unstable entity, and so people are looking for different configurations of territory. North America could be
but let's get to a very basic question. How much agency do you attribute to the person of Donald Trump? I mean, the official narrative would seem to be that Donald Trump is like some kind of loose cannon doing all these things. It's all being attributed to Trump, but I have great doubts about that. I think Trump is really the front man for some kind of political faction, but don't ask me to outline it in that much more detail. But it's, but of course, these U.S. presidents are just sort of front men, really, for various political factions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, who is pulling Donald Trump's strings? Who is he answerable to? And it's really not a hard question. He's answerable to Netanyahu. He's answerable to the Israel First Lobby. He is answerable to, the Zionist coalition, international coalition. And, there's, Big Pharma, and there's the oil lobby, and there's lots of lobbies, but when it comes to the governance of the United States, there's never really been a lobby like that of, is it Israel? It's not really Israel because it's a global, organized jewelry is a global
The whole Trump
picture.
thing is a very bewildering, confusing picture. And there do seem to be hints that Trump isn't all that well, even. I don't really know for sure. That he may also be suffering from certain amounts of dementia. One interesting thing is we really got into a gerontocracy sort of situation, maybe kind of like late Soviet Union. I remember, as a teenager.
Gerontocracy, like old people.
Yeah,
dominating.
Well, I remember when Ronald Reagan was sworn in, and I was just a teenager at the time, and I looked it up recently. He was 69 when he was sworn in, and I think his 70th birthday was maybe, I don't know, a few months after his assuming office, but there were all these, he was the oldest president ever, I think. But now, you literally have, like the election before last, Trump and Biden, how old were they respectively? I mean, they were both significantly older than Reagan was. I mean, they were as old as Reagan was when he ran for his second term. That's interesting. Even other figures like Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, I mean, they're all old. It's
who do you see?
No offense, Tony, but but you're not running for political office either. So.
Oh well, how do you know? I haven't ever declared that.
I thought you would have told me.
I'll hold back for the time being, but my big days are yet to come.
Yeah, okay, but it is an interesting development that U.S. has become kind of this, at least at the very top, kind of a gerontocracy.
It changes the subject from Zionism nicely, but who do you see as the up-and-coming people in the United States? Like, there's going to have to be a new generation take over.
Well, I guess they're grooming J.D. Vance to be...
Yeah, not just who you see as, the probable inheritors of all this, but the people who are shining a beacon, the people who are articulating, the people who would seem to have the capacity, the internal smarts, and the logistical sensibility and money backing. Like, do you see any young people emerging that attract attention, that you feel drawn to, that you would support?
I maybe don't follow U.S. politics, like especially, well, there's deep politics, which continues with its own logic and structure independently of who's elected or not, and then there's sort of, I guess, what you could call shallow politics, which is just the electoral horse race politics sort of stuff, which doesn't maybe affect policy as much as it's purported to do. But actually, the whole Trump thing is, because actually, like I remember so well when Obama defeated McCain for the presidency, and he was supposed to be such a breath of fresh air and all that. But in terms of actual policy, Obama wasn't really that different from a third Bush term. No, I mean, stylistically it was different because, he's sort of this hip black man or half black man. But in terms of actual policy, and I think various astute commentators pointed out that Obama was governing significantly to the right of Richard Nixon, say. What was supposed to be his signature achievement, which was this health thing, Obamacare, was actually came from a Republican think tank, and it was really Romney Care, except that then Mitt Romney was, Obama's opponent for running for a second term. So he had to disavow his own health care plan, which he had put in place in Massachusetts, because it was Romney, because now it had been rebranded as Obamacare, and he was running against Obama. It's the weirdest thing.
Obama seemed to be running Biden. He seemed to be more or less the top guy, at least that we could see. Well, now, what about all of the people who...
Biden senile. That was and is genuinely senile. That's quite striking.
Well, this failure to pass on the torch, to keep on the gerontology side. I'm going to introduce a different subject.
Here's another question, which is this Kamala Harris woman. All of this, what happened with the way they suddenly decided that Biden wasn't going to be able to run, but then they sort of anointed Kamala Harris, I guess you could say Soviet style, because there wasn't time to have proper primaries. But really, if they had had a proper primary season and some, charismatic, reasonable, middle of the road Democratic candidate had emerged, that person, it seems to me, would very likely win in a landslide over Trump. They deliberately put in a very, very weak candidate so that Trump could win, I guess.
Well, those who are in a position to be contestants for these high offices, perhaps I could introduce a new theme that we actually introduced when we first arrived here and did a 10-minute clip. What's going on with the European Union's excommunication of now it's 59 people we focus particularly on Natalie Yam, for instance.
Well, did we focus on her so much?
Well, anyway.
I mean, maybe off camera we did.
Yeah, well, and then I wrote about it when we posted it, and I gave.
Well, she's worth writing about. I'm not saying she's not. I mean, she's definitely worth writing about.
Yeah, Pascal Lotez did a really, on behalf of Neutrality Studies. He did a wonderful interview with her, and obviously there's a person of, she's eloquent, she's quite beautiful, she's experienced, she's got roots in different parts of the world. Imagine, she seems to have a strong base in Switzerland. She's a Swiss citizen, but she's from the Cameroon, and she has this ability to represent people from Africa. I'm thinking of Cynthia McKinney as sort of had that attribute of being an American politician, and but being able to represent people in Africa, in particular.
Our friend Mike Palmer in private email said that none of this was that surprising, because it seems that the EU is just preparing for war, and this is one of the things you do in wartime. You silence dissident voices. They did it in the 2 world wars, and
and we talked about that you can see this as an fascism, and you raise fascism, and of course Mr. H comes up and the all-purpose person that if you want to say something terrible about something, you compare him to Hitler.
That's a narrative imperative.
That's a narrative imperative. But anyway, here are all these, very Jacques Bode, people who are articulate, well-informed, in an excellent position to provide public service and represent, people in elected office, and they're being excommunicated, not only in the European Union area, but the way Yam described it, she's in Switzerland, which is not technically in the European Union, but it applies to her that she can't travel throughout the world, that somehow this idea of a universal jurisdiction is being applied. And, it's a very insidious concoction. I know it's, when I first arrived here, you were stirred up by it a lot, Jonathan.
Oh, yes, but it's also, but this combination of tragedy and farce is also one of these aspects of things. I was, like, you can talk about Herr Hitler as much as you like, but okay, the guy had an army, you have to admit the guy had, he still lost in the end, but he had an army, okay? And actually Napoleon Bonaparte before him, say what you want about the old boy, he had an army, okay? I mean these guys are just, beating the war drums, and they don't have an army. I mean, I guess they could somehow...
These guys like Starmer, Merz, Macron...
They just don't have a friggin' army. Of course, the EU and NATO even does not really have an army. They just have, they only have an army insofar as the individual nation states have an army. And it's sort of interesting, they don't also have the repressive organs of the state. I mean Hitler had the Gestapo and had the concentration camps, and Stalin had I guess it was called the NKVD back then, before it was the KGB, and he had the Gulag, the camps. But the EU doesn't have any concentration camps, and it doesn't have any secret police that I know of. Though of course it was secret, But anyway, they don't seem to have any Gestapo or.
I bet they have torture chambers.
I don't think so. Well, I don't know. I really don't think they do. But they still have this power via the merger of, this is a kind of fascism, this merger of corporate and state power that, because they sort of, I guess you could say they outsource this oppression of people, the repression to these private corporations. It's a very different kind of fascism. I guess I said that in our 10-minute
Yeah, we were looking for
conversation.
other terms, and excommunication came up,
Well,
which is a religious term, but now it's given this secular spin.
yes, but excommunication is an act to excommunicate people, whereas fascism is supposedly a political system or ideology, so they're not quite the same category of words. But we can work on that some more.
Yeah, we need new terms, and that's what we're working on with
But
narrative
what I
and
mean
narrative.
what I mean is that these guys are beating the war drums and they seem to be trying to prepare for a war, but they don't have a friggin' army. I mean, their only way to wage any war against Russia would be to convince the U.S. somehow to do it for them, because it doesn't seem that Britain, France, or Germany, who are the main warmongers in terms of their political leadership, have any army. They also don't have any popular support. They're the most, the political leadership, I mean, of all of these countries is at single-digit percentage approval ratings, I believe.
And yet we're living in this highly militarized era where, there's all of this competition among, for missiles. Iran takes part in this. Russia has emerged as a demonstrable superpower. I mean, it's had experience on the ground, which the U.S. When do we ever see them persisting?
The warmongering on the part, from these European countries is entirely coming from people who, to all intents and purposes, don't have much of an army. I mean, it's very.
It's hard to understand. It's just like, obviously they're not representing themselves. They're just embodiments of higher powers that are pulling their strings.
Well, the whole thing is farcical on many levels.
And the European people are,
I don't think
fed
there's,
up.
for all the propaganda, I don't think that there's any support for having a war with Russia, and I don't get the feeling. Well, I don't know. I'm just here in Spain. I mean, that there's hardly anybody who thinks the Russian army is going to enter Poland and then cross Germany, and then cross France, and then, I don't know, march across the Pyrenees and show up here in Spain. I mean, nobody believes that. We talk about forbidding formidable geography. I mean, the Russian army would kind of end up getting defeated by the formidable geography. At least they wouldn't end up getting defeated by any army, because there is no bloody army. But the geography is pretty formidable, But it's just...
Well, I feel there's quite a draw, should be, between Russia and Canada. We're both huge countries with small populations. We both got a lot of natural resources. Putin is actually, developing natural resources. The Liberal government of Canada, now followed in by Carney, they have this thing about not developing the natural resources, leaving it in the ground. Everything has got to be climate change. It's really disgusting, this climate, this idea that, the biggest enemy we face is carbon in the atmosphere, CO2, and we've got to, make every policy secondary to removing carbon, and we have this money expansionist.
But Canada is really very much under the ideological capture of the United States. I mean, it's like, but what is this Monroe Doctrine redux? It's sort of, I mean, one interpretation of it is them, falling back on a kind of, I mean, they're realizing that in the wider world, which is Eurasia and Africa, they're losing the game. So I guess just hunkering down on the Western Hemisphere, which is the real part of the world they really do have tight control over. Well, they have tight control over Western Europe that could be crumbling, because these sort of Quislingist governments in Western Europe are so unpopular that either they really cling to power by force and start, well, to even maintain any semblance of electoral democracy, you'd think that these governments like Starmer in the UK and Macron in France and the other guy in Germany, Merz, you think all these guys are going to be gone, pretty soon. One would think. But we live in interesting times. I just...
And, there is the physical warring element, but financial warfare, has become increasingly elaborate and complex and central to it. And of course, we see the fast rising gold and silver, which is a kind of marker that the fiat money is losing.
Well, yeah,
the fiat money has no value. It has value as long as people trust it, but there's no reason to trust the fiat money anymore. So the U.S. is going to face some kind of reckoning. It's not just the U.S. Like the money system has to be transformed. It is in the process of being transformed, and that's going to dislocate society on a major level. There's always, since the COVID days, there's always been this new element of a really present sense that the bottom could just fall out of things in an unbelievable way.
That the ruling class, who mostly don't show their faces, I guess you could say, are getting increasingly desperate, and that a lot of this Trump regime stuff is really acts of weakness and desperation, possibly. I think I'm tending towards that interpretation of things. But anyways.
Yeah. What's gone?
Wind this down. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we should wind it down. Anyway, as far as we'll wind this down. Among the young people emerging, I have to say I've been watching, and I made no secret of it with you, Jonathan. Nicholas Fuentes has opened up many subjects that were undiscussable. He's sort of carried along Tucker Carlson and what's her name? Owen. Candace Owen. And so there's this fascinating thing going on the right, where you have a real discussion about the United States' future in relationship to Israel.
But I don't think I don't view these people as true independent agents. I mean, I think they must represent some sort of deep. To varying extents in different deep state political faction. I mean, Tucker Carlson, may well actually be a CIA asset.
Almost certainly is.
So, all of this stuff becomes very...
well, this is what we get. This is what we can see. If we had better connections, we could look behind the scenes and see what's going on and, behind the stage and getting ready to come onto stage. But this is what we get. And so, of course, everybody, if you know their name, they're in the game. Who said that?
That's Miri AF.
That pretty much everybody in the public eye is there because they're allowed to be, and that some powerful forces want them to be, and that they are representing interests that remain hidden. And I certainly
you want to listen so much to the ventriloquist dummy, but you have to find. But really, it's the ventriloquist that matters, not the ventriloquist dummy.
But give us the real people that we should be paying attention to.
Well, I think we should wind down this conversation, so I won't.
Okay.
I won't. Besides, I have another conversation with God coming up. in the next few days. So I'll ask him, and then I'll
that's good.
I'll transmit it to you guys.
Okay, well, we're at minutes and over and out. See you later.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank
You're most very welcome, Tony.
Okay. Cheerio.